Good evening, and thank you for joining us. It's so important to us as a group, but also folks working in the sector or connected to intimate partner violence to see the importance of traditional land acknowledgements. So as a staff, a community member, someone who lives, works, and resides within Waterloo region on the traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Attawandaron, I'd like to acknowledge that land and thank the keepers who have taken care of this land, the historical context of it, but also acknowledge that when I'm thinking about colonization, when we're looking at colonization and the impact, that we're not talking about it in a historical context, that we see the importance of that conversation ongoing. But also realizing that we have the pleasure of having panelists with us from across Turtle Island and many participants as well, whether you are part of the academic community within Waterloo region, you're traveling to attend there, you're visiting from afar, that we encourage you to consider the land that you're on. And when you venture and travel and work and play in other areas, that you see that as important. When we look at its context, especially in relationship to the topic of today and the idea of creating community of support around intimate partner violence, we need to think about colonization and gender-based violence as a tool within it. So really being critical of that ongoing practice, but also exploring the teachings and the beliefs and values of Indigenous, First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities and individuals historically pre-colonization that were rooted in equality and the idea of centering women within the medicine wheel and practices and how that has shifted. So in our discussions tonight, to really take that away, think about how you can put it into practice so that it's not just about acknowledging the land as a statement, but really something you take in your steps and you walk that territorial acknowledgement moving forward. So thank you for being here tonight. I am also going to let folks know that, well, we're here talking about creating a community of support, that we are also talking about a difficult topic. And that for many of us, we're here because maybe it has a personal impact to our lives, to our work, to our loved ones. So it's very important for us to take care of each other, to be aware that, it is okay to take space, to step away if you need to know that this webinar will be available after if you might be in a better place to observe it, but really be kind to yourself and know that we're here and that I'll talk later about what we can do to support you, and we'll provide some resources along the way. In the chat, you'll see local resources, you'll see national resources and provincial resources that you can access. As well, we have one of our great dedicated volunteers from the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region, who's available here to support you. So there's a separate Zoom link. If you require, you can send a message through the Q&A feature, and that Zoom link can be sent to you. And that individual can meet with you on a one-on-one conversation if you feel that that would be more beneficial for immediate support. But also know that those 24-hour support lines and programs and services within our community and beyond are available for continued conversation. So to get into tonight's conversation, to get to know the great folks that have come together to have this conversation, I'll start by formally introducing myself. So my name is Jessica St. Peter. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the manager of public education at the community-based Sexual Assault Center here in Waterloo Region, so the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region. I manage our public education program, which is our upstream prevention program. So SASC, short form for the Sexual Assault Support Center, not only wants to ensure that we have wraparound supports for survivors or individuals who've been impacted by sexual violence and oppression, but also how do we as an organization, as individuals and a community, take action for that prevention upstream work. So we're very pleased to be here, and I'm glad to be among these great folks doing such unique work, but all really focused on exactly what tonight's about. So creating that community of support And I'm thankful not only to be with these folks, but that many of you have joined, because really we all have a right to live free of violence and trauma, and together we can discuss how that's possible. So I'm going to pass it along to my peers on the panel, and I will start with just, I guess, the order of my screen, and I'll pass it along to Veen.
Hi, everyone. My name is Veen Wong. I use the pronouns she and her. I am a registered social worker in Ontario, and I've spent nearly the last 10 years specifically working with women and families who've experienced gender and intimate partner violence. So largely my clinical practice has been focused on providing trauma counseling, as well as some legal and crisis supports as well too, and that's within the shelter systems and the community level programming. Currently, I am a public health PhD student at the University of Waterloo, and I'm also a member of the Human-Computer Interaction and Health Lab. So my research focus is looking into ways that we can do preventative upstream usage of technology in order to shift social and gender norms to prevent intimate partner violence. So it's quite exciting to be part of this amazing panel. And I also wanted to thank everyone who's participating in this really important conversation and joining us in for this talk. So thank you.
Thank you. Chelsea.
Hi, my name's Chelsea Bromley. My pronouns are she, her. I am a recent Waterloo undergrad. I did my degree in psychology and social development studies through Renison. I took some specialized courses at Renison on intimate partner violence, and I did my research for my thesis on people's perceptions of victims and survivors of intimate partner violence. And I'm really excited to be here, and thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Chelsea. Wisdom.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Wissam Osman. I'm a coordinator of program Toward Violence-Free Homes. It's one of the Coalition of Muslim Women programs. In this program, we try to raise awareness about domestic violence in general and intimate partner violence specifically to within the racialized and including Muslim communities. And the other part of our program is to support racialized women and give them that emotional support and financial support over like providing childcare, try to work out the barriers during this hard time that they go through, also navigate the system for them, where finding the best service that works for them or serve them the best at that time. And we do all of that through our team of community peer workers who cover 10 languages. So the communication with the women or with the community during the raising awareness part is in that community language. So that's kind of like bringing the information needed and information about resources and even discussing the issue within culture respectful manner. And I'll be talking more about this program later on.
Great, thank you. And Melissa, last but not least.
Hi everyone, I'm Melissa Veroni, or I call me Melissa as well. I am also a registered social worker. I'm located actually in northern Alberta. I am for 15 years now, have actually been in the social sector field, supporting individuals, both men and women and children and families, surviving intimate partner violence. I have done a lot of work and actually support men in particular trying to survive it. I serve on the Council of Social Work Education for the United States, as well as a director of the John Howard Society here. And I'm very honored to be asked to be part of such an amazing panel. And my hope today is that we can not only bring awareness and education, and also inspire hope. So thank you.
Well, it sounds like we're in for quite the adventure together and a lot of different perspectives, so that's great to hear. To get us started, it would be interesting to get a sense of what people's ideas are around intimate partner violence by starting with our first poll. So have you or has someone you known ever experienced intimate partner violence? So you might see IPV in some of the poll questions, so intimate partner violence. And what kinds of abuse is included in intimate partner violence? So we'll give a few minutes. And then maybe just for discussion's sake, our great supports from the library can share those results to give us an idea of what people are thinking out there. So 83% of folks who've joined us this evening have themselves or someone they know have experienced intimate partner violence. 17% say no, and 0% saying unsure, which is interesting, right? That idea of being very clear cut of no, right? And what that would look like, and also the yeses that we see. And then for number 2, what kind of abuse is included in intimate partner violence? So emotional, psychological, physical. And so we might see that some of the other pieces kind of dropped off, and then looking at the 75%, because all of the above, right? So people might have thought they were starting by clicking that they could choose more than one, but as you can see in the question, it's a single choice. But we often know that when we're talking about intimate partner violence, quite often when we look at all those different options, the emotional and the physical are what we hear most about in a lot of conversations. So thank you for that. So when our first question, we're going to explore what is intimate partner violence and who does it affect as kind of a theme to get us started. So I'm going to pose my first question to Melissa, and of course other people can add in along the way. But what is the difference between domestic violence and intimate partner violence? And why do we use the term intimate partner violence, and what does it exclude? Based on specifically your talk a lot about the gender variation in individuals that you support and work with.
Absolutely, great questions. And it's a very hard question sometimes to answer too. Abuse is not clear cut, like you mentioned, that is hitting, right? So intimate partner violence is an inclusive umbrella term, and it varies depending on your relationship. So I can have an intimate partner relationship with my partner, or maybe a family member. It can also include elder abuse, violence in between the LGBTQ community, among many others. The main emphasis is that it's always about power and control. That's at the heart of it. It is more of an inclusive term. Domestic violence tends to be a bit outdated in some research as well, and it tends to be quite heterosexist in that definition as well, because there's a lot of, a man abuses a woman, which is not always the case, although that's what most of the research is suggesting right now. As I mentioned, the root causes are about power and control. There are various types, as we saw here in the panel. The most common actually tends to be emotional psychological abuse. And it also tends to be the most difficult to try to know for sure. So that's maybe why some of our peers are wondering, I don't know if I'm being abused. And one of the most common tools with the emotional psychological abuse is actually gaslighting, which we probably heard a lot in the community lately as well. That is one of many examples of emotional abuse, and psychological and verbal, name calling, belittling, embarrassing as well. Physical is a bit more clear cut for most people, biting, hitting, holding down, as well as any form of violence with or without a weapon. Sexual violence is not necessarily only about rape or an assault. It can also be trying to force people to do things that they don't want to do, or even trying to make them feel guilty about that as well, not respecting someone's sexual boundaries. We also have stalking, which is actually a very common form of abuse as well too. That can also be not only necessary in a relationship, but maybe even an ex or a friend as well. And that's why we use the word intimate violence. Spiritual, when one's religion or spiritual beliefs are being used against them. Indoctrination can also occur as well. Some cultures can also promote other things as what's more tolerated, I guess would be the word I would use. Neglect would also apply as well. There are so many, I don't know if I'm answering all your questions. Did I miss something, Jessica? Okay.
No, that's great. I didn't know if maybe any of the other panelists had any contributions to make around the difference between domestic violence and intimate partner violence, or what they've experienced even in their research or their conversations about how people might feel more comfortable relating to either kind of term or wording. Because when we hear, I know for myself, over the years, even the term woman abuse, as opposed to intimate partner violence or domestic violence, and really amplifying that gendered analysis when we're talking about the disproportionate kind of survivors in the situation versus those who cause harm. But also in our work with engaging men and boys, those kind of the stereotypes around masculinity that create stigma to having conversations or identifying as, say, a victim or survivor of intimate partner violence. So yeah, does anyone else on the panel have something to kind of discuss about their experience around that?
Yeah, I think one of the things I wanted to add, and in my experience working in the sector now, doing more research on the field, I'm very careful with using terms like gender-based violence, because too often with intimate partner violence, domestic violence, these terms can invoke a lot of like dichotomy. So like Melissa had mentioned about like male perpetration of violence against like female victims, and survivors of victims being in conjuring this image of being very female oriented. And Melissa, as you mentioned too, that quite a bit of your clinical work actually involves supporting male survivors and of violence. And so just even the use of languaging, things that we might see within our legal system, within different laws that are enacted, the way that some of our social supports are provided as well too. I know with my experience when I worked in the York region, the two main organizations that provided gender-based violence supports were only supporting women and children. And so there was actually a complete lack of support for male identifying individuals who were experiencing intimate partner violence. And so just, I wanted to bring that up in terms of the use of like gendered use of language is quite important, I think, within the sector.
Mm-hmm. Great point.
Absolutely.
That really makes me think too, not only around how centers or services present themselves in the language they use, but also in the focus of like creating a community of support, that when our friends or our family or our peers are disclosing or talking about their situations, they're not often using any of this language, right? These aren't the words that they're expressing. So just to consider that when we're looking at how we can support somebody, that it's more about their feelings, what they're going through, and less about, you know, them saying, oh, I'm experiencing intimate partner violence, or I'm experiencing this, but really being in tune to that. And even when you were going through like the various forms of violence, I was thinking too around human trafficking work, right? And how very specific, like, while it's unique in terms of providing support, that the experiences around the grooming process, the recruitment, they're presented like intimate relationships, right? Those folks are brought into those situations and relationships thinking that they're in an intimate relationship with the individual. So just how complex something like intimate partner violence can be.
Yeah, and if I can add, like talking about the community that we serve, the racialized community, immigrants, and usually they have that language barrier, and saying like it's been known that the violence at home will be considered domestic violence in general, and the term of intimate partner violence is kind of not like, you don't hear it much when even people talking about it and things, and it's always related to either physical abuse or sexual abuse, but not all other kind of abuse. And so it's the terms usually, as you say, Jessica, it's all about their feelings and what they are experiencing, and yeah, we should be like also like careful when understanding. Even we need to investigate more. So most of, and you will see, like even when I'm talking, because usually this is what we use, the domestic violence, I'll be mentioning domestic violence much more than intimate partner violence, but that's most of the time means intimate partner violence, just because this is the community I'm dealing with and this is the language that they understand.
I think that's a great transition, and I'd love to hear more, because I'm wondering, when you think about, you're talking about your program and those adaptations in the language, if you want to share a little bit about your program in connection to what are some of the assumptions and biases that create barriers to seeking support, right? We're already talking about this, like language is one of those obvious pieces, but if you could expand a little more for us.
Yeah, so when we started the program, it was all about like raise awareness about the family violence in general due to pandemic and things. And maybe later on I'll be talking more about this. But we started with having those sessions with the community. We provided training for a team of peer workers. We provided the training that allowed them to bring those information to their communities. In general, it's about like stress management, anger management, mental health issues, stuff like that, and then provide what are the resources available in the community. We sensed that most topic that the community doesn't know about is the domestic violence or the family violence, where they can go, when they can go. But we couldn't bring that anywhere unless we have that evidence-based report. That's when we thought of running a need assessment for Muslim women. Because this is, of course, this is our target groups, and we're targeting isolated women who doesn't have that skills to search the information themselves. So the main barriers, of course, in the beginning, it was the language. And language barrier, if not the language, but the lack of knowledge. Like even with the women who speaks English, still there is lack of knowledge about what are the resources available and when to reach out. Most of the women that we run the assessment, they participated in that need assessment, and there's 600 people participated in that assessment. Some of them were, of course, the service provider themselves. They contributed to that. They had their own survey. That's what the challenges that they see when they provide in their services. But we reached to online for 267, I think, and then also we reached to those isolated women who doesn't have that skills to, although not necessarily, they're used to fill up the survey through phone calls, so in their languages. So the peers reached to those women over the phone, and they filled up the survey so they were not dropped from this survey. So the challenges was the feeling, or that common knowledge, that as soon as you reach out to the police or anyone, you will be losing control. You'll be losing your kids. Another assumption is that the only way to reach help is to go to the shelter. and they don't have any information. Many of them, not all of them. Some community that they had good knowledge about it and how to connect to shelters, but the majority, they didn't have even that knowledge that there is shelters for women, and there is like you can have your privacy, and privacy is, it's a huge thing, like for Muslim women, where they need to practice their prayers, they need to like make sure that their kids with them. And then also another barrier was when they know that the older kids, like 14 years old or older, they can join them to the shelters. That also until now still it's a barrier, because in our culture kids stay with you at home until they get married, or they grown up, even they're working and everything, but still they are in that family home until they have their own home as like a family, I mean. So those are many of the barriers, and we can like, and at the out of those like focus groups that we run, I think there was some recommendation. So the recommendation was provide many like information in many languages, provide some pictures even for like the shelters, or like what is the expectation for them, that so it's they understand where they're going to. Provide connect with programs that has community peer workers, where they can communicate with them and understand who with someone who understand their culture and backgrounds. And also like one of the recommendation was having like open house for different organization, or like shelters, or other resources for faith organization, other community organization, where they can understand the process, understand the situation, and then they can bring it back. So that's all, and also connecting with the recommendation from the service providers to connect to the grassroots organizations from different communities to let them know about the needs. So it's both ways. So even the service provider learning about the community, and the community learning about the service available, so we can at least like fill up the gaps that prevent our community members to reach out to services.
That sounds so incredible, just, you know, based on your outline of the program and how many of those larger systemic barriers and issues that are at play that would stop somebody from seeking support are being addressed, but also really amplifying the community's voices to those systems and institutions that are providing support. So thank you so much for doing that work. And I'm glad that you know, that I think of, even as an employee of one of those community-based organizations, the value of that knowledge in terms of us doing our work and moving forward. I'm wondering, Chelsea, if you want to speak from your research and experience about, from an individual level, how those barriers might play out for people seeking support.
Yeah, for my research, I focused a lot more on an individual level of how survivors of both intimate partner violence and domestic abuse would feel seeking support or have difficulty reaching out to others based on how they were feeling, how others would perceive them. So a lot of times I feel like some survivors will reach out to people. They may feel brave, and they may start telling some people or exploring kind of what's going on in their situation with friends or close family members. And a lot of people respond with things like, oh, you know, you're so strong, you don't have to take that, or you can always just leave. Or people think those can be helpful because they think they are maybe empowering them, and they come from a place of like good heart. They're trying to be kind, but for some survivors, it means that people don't understand, or they can be scared of being judged, or there's biases, and it can shut them down almost and stop them from reaching out. So my research focus on looking at what individual levels of type of abuse, the length, and the kind of entrenchment in the relationship. Were they married? If they were married versus dating for 3 months and they were talking to someone about their relationship, would that cause people to think, you know, like, just respond differently and things like that. The other focus that my research didn't get to reach yet, but I definitely thought about when I was thinking about this question was from a young teen perspective. I feel like a lot of young teens or young adults who are entering their first relationship that may begin to become abusive, they don't really understand what's going on, or they haven't experienced it yet, and it can be very difficult for them to reach out, because I do think that the media creates kind of this culture of like normalcy around abuse. I find, as I'm only 23 myself, but I find like a lot of shows and music videos and things, like I remember when Harley Quinn and the Joker was a big Halloween costume that a lot of like 15-year-old couples were doing, and I knew what the actual basis behind their incredibly abusive relationship was, but it's projected in lots of TV shows and things. I find, as someone doing research, and I know, like, oh, that's gaslighting, or oh, that's emotional abuse, or that's neglect. A lot of TV shows portray that as like passion and intensity, and that's something people should strive for. And I think a lot of young teens then get confused, and they don't know how to reach out, and they don't know how to explain that they think this is wrong, but they're supposed to also want this in their relationships. And that's what I think is a major barrier that can start young relationships, and then can also have people follow into that cycle of continuing these relationships because they don't know the difference between what's healthy versus not healthy.
Really interesting research, to be honest, and I'm curious because something I see often, and maybe even, to be quite blunt, I even dealt with myself in surviving as well, where internal stigma, I find, is something we often ignore in research and even in treatment sometimes. Does your research look into that by any chance as a potential variable?
My research was just the stepping stone of many studies I would love to branch out from. In that, I definitely think it would be interesting to move it not from only a disclosing point, but to a treatment point, and how people carry those perceptions of themselves throughout the entire recovery process and healing process from those relationships. So that's definitely something I would love to do in the future.
Absolutely. I often find people say, I'm not that person. It didn't happen. And I think that's something that hinders people's ability to reach out for help.
Yeah, there's so many things we've talked about in terms of, systemic barriers. We've talked about personal barriers, talked about even, those internalized barriers. So something to throw out to our audience as a poll, if we could throw up our next poll, because now thinking about our role in creating that community support system, why do you think that people refrain to step in if they suspect, why do you think refrain from stepping in if they suspect that someone they know is experiencing intimate partner violence, right? Because we've now heard the various reasons that someone might not seek support, but now us as communities, as individuals, as service providers, as peers, as professionals, why do you think people refrain from stepping in if they suspect someone's experiencing intimate partner violence? And I'll give a few minutes for that one. So Jessica, when you think that folks are, I can't see when they're coming in, but if you have a sense of people's responses, if you'd like to share the results, that'd be great. Okay, so we have 27% believe it's none of their business or don't want to get involved, and 73% thinking all of the above. So believe it's none of their business, don't want to get involved, figure people can just leave. So we heard about that being a barrier. There are ample of services for everyone who experiences intimate partner violence, which we've heard that there aren't, unfortunately, right? There aren't enough services to meet the needs or that kind of present or reflect the communities in need. So thank you for answering that poll. We've seen a lot of shifts, I know, and many of the panelists can probably speak to how the pandemic has impacted their work, their research, even their own personal lives and personal relationships, I'm sure, as a result of the pandemic and what it meant for individuals being in isolation, community supports shifting in terms of service delivery. So I'm going to pose this question, and Veen, I'll start with you if you're okay to lead us in this discussion. The pandemic challenged many things for a number of people. How has the pandemic impacted individuals surviving intimate partner violence specifically?
Like you mentioned, so many different ways. I think the biggest challenge that I found while providing support during the pandemic and the biggest shift that happened, because at that point I was providing community-based counseling. And so pre-pandemic, my clients would actually travel to my office. And so there was already a layer of safety, a layer of security that the clients could actually be where they're in a safe space. The office is very confidential. Addresses are, because of the clientele and the population that we're working with, there's oftentimes a lot of immediate safety concerns. And so being able to actually be in a safe location to do things like work through counseling, or even more practical items like being able to apply, work with transitional counselors, being able to work with our lawyers, and having that safe space to actually discuss some of these things without the abusive individual being in the same realm. Whereas when COVID happened and the lockdowns and all of the other measures, which are great public health measures and needed public health measures, what actually ended up happening was a lot of these individuals lost that safe space, lost that ability to be able to actually reach out and receive supports. And so a big challenge that I had clinically was actually figuring out whether or not it was safe to do a video counseling session or a telephone counseling session with my clients, because I couldn't be sure whether or not the perpetrator or the individual who was abusive was actually in the room, or if they're or even if they had separated from the abusive individuals. We know a lot of individuals, especially parents, who, because of the lockdowns and because of school closures and outbreaks, had to provide childcare. And so even then it might not have actually been safe to discuss this for a different reason, because of having dependents within the home. Other barriers, other things that had happened within the pandemic that was quite unique was a lot of staffing limitations. The organization that I worked for had quite a lot of individuals that worked in the shelters and transitional homes. And so pre-COVID, being able to have staff be flexible and work at different locations was sorely needed, which couldn't be done during the pandemic. So yeah, clinical challenges, just even practical operational staffing challenges. There were also budget limitations. A lot of the shelters are not equipped for isolation. And so a lot of times individuals and families may be actually sharing a room. And with COVID, being able to actually be isolated or have your own space was a very difficult budgeting challenge for a lot of organizations, who then had to shift, even though they had originally the physical shelter space, they'd had to shift into reaching out for, let's say, like hotels and booking rooms. And these were exceptional costs that the organization had not planned for, had not budgeted for. No one knew this was coming. And so there's been quite a lot of limitations in that sense. There's been a lot of challenges and shifts that has happened, and I know, like, specifically I'm talking about more of like a Southern Ontario, York region perspective, and so it'll be interesting just to hear about from the other panelists as well too, if there's similarities or differences based on your regions and the shifts that had to happen within the pandemic.
I think that's well said, Bean. And up here in Northern Alberta, I'm quite rural based, so we're even more limited in resources on a good day without COVID. And one of the things I found in my practice where I do a lot of work with intimate partner violence is I actually did have the individual who does abuse the other individual actually hide behind the camera. Right. And so we had to be quite unique in how we would approach that and try to create safety. So not only was there less safe spots in a therapy setting, but also for children who are being abused, school is sometimes the only time they get a break from abuse. Right. And then also work might be a break from abuse too. And so I have found, and I'm really curious if there's research out there, I have yet to look on this part, you know, the prevalence and how much more exposure people have felt because they've actually been isolating with potentially the individual that abuses them, and they don't have those breaks that maybe they so desperately need. So it's been really trying, and our shelters here have actually had to put people away, to be honest. They had to turn them around, and it's quite sad. I mean, no one planned for this pandemic, and they do need these precautions as well. And I'm hoping that we can learn from this tragedy and helping people.
Thank you for sharing it. Oh, sorry, Veen, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to echo what Melissa was saying too. I know in my experience during the pandemic, there was also a lot of issues in terms of spacing and being able to accept families and individuals to shelter spaces or the hotel spaces in the pandemic. And so I know with the last poll that we had provided all of the participants here, one of the options was whether or not, like, they just assume, people may assume that individuals can just leave. And yes, we do have these services, we do have these social supports. It's not quite as simple as just being able to leave, and we're seeing more and more of that, particularly with the constraints that the pandemic has created and caused.
Thank you. It's, oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's the actually what allowed us to start our program, or maybe like pushed us more to start our program, is like the huge number of like even like reporting or reaching out to like women crisis, reaching out to a service provider within the intimate partner violence or domestic violence, and that's because they are in the same space all the time, and the loss of jobs, and so there's no, like, they're not financially independent anymore, and usually they're not even, like, when they are in an abusive relationship. So all that, the pandemic really make it like, if they are not, they don't wanna, like, they're thinking of stepping out of this relationship, pandemic make it even harder for them to go out, and especially with the rules in the shelters. If you find a space in the shelters, because of like the big number, if you find a space to be admitted to a shelter, you have to isolate yourself for 10 days, and that's what's really it's like really affecting the mental health of the victims or the survivors, and finding them counseling when they are at home it's really hard with the pandemic because they can't go to the in person, and if they can go, some of the counselors decided that they can't do in person due to health concerns at their homes and stuff like that, and then when to leave and where to take it. Libraries were closed, places were closed. If they're going to do it over the phone and they don't want to do it at home, they have to be walking, and now with the winter hitting, it was an extra layer of where to go. That all of those contributed really to reaching out for help. Yeah.
I was just going to add, I mean, it's so sad. And, you know, even here, our hospitals were closed for different things. So even people accessing emergency support were actually turned away, or actually told, like, if it wasn't something related to COVID, they weren't able to help. And I mean, and then it just further, you know, stigmatize, I can't talk right now, you know, individuals as well. And what people may or may not know, like previous data suggests that Canada on average spends a minimum $7.4 billion a year helping survivors of intimate partner violence. I actually think that number is quite low in considering the aftermath. I'm really curious because that's pre-COVID. And I'm wondering now in the years to come, with all of the challenges and barriers that we've had, what that number may actually be, considering that we've had so many limitations placed upon us and quickly, you know, and haven't been able to serve a vast majority of people throughout Canada and actually worldwide, because it is a world pandemic that has always, unfortunately, existed.
And just to add to Melissa, I think what you were quoting was actually a report from the government of Canada, and this would have been, I think, back actually in 2009. So it's quite outdated. To my knowledge, there hasn't been anything that they haven't redone this report. And it was specifically like the over $7 billion was actually specifically cost lost to spousal violence. So that's a subset of intimate partner violence. It only looks at common law and married couples. And so if we're thinking with this very small subset, and we've talked earlier about all of the different types of relationships that are included within intimate partner violence, this small circle of it is already costing over $7 billion. You can only imagine how much more it actually is if we include all of intimate partner violence and services and supports and the hurt and damage that's done with it. So it's quite significant.
Absolutely. Thank you for expanding that.
Even when you were talking about just with the shutdowns that have happened and folks working remotely, or children being out of school, and what that lack of space away from homes, but also the lack of connection, right, and opportunities or support networks. And when I think about that economic cost of intimate partner violence or spousal violence, not considering the generational impact, not considering the impact of beyond kind of specific related issues, right? But seeing how intimate partner violence and the trauma associated with it integrates and filtrates through all aspects of our life, right? And when we think about the folks who are on this webinar tonight, or I think about even as panelists here, creating that community of care, how it doesn't take into consideration the impact on us as well, right? When we're trying to reach out, or we're trying to make those connections, or you're bringing food to somebody because that's how you feel like you're the only way you can do it. Or if you're opening your home to somebody, or you're, you know, lending cell phones and lending cars and things like that, that folks do because they want to contribute or they want to support in some way. That was great, but I think that this would be a good time if we could share the resource slide, because these are resources within our communities. These are resources that exist that you can take a picture of it once it's posted, so that you have that, as well as feel free to copy and paste the chat if you'd like. just to make sure that you have access to those. All right, thank you. And we'll share that again at the end in case anyone didn't get a chance to snap a picture of that. But what are we all here for? We're here to think of what steps can we take to create that community of support. We've heard, some of the barriers, we've heard, the overarching implications of intimate partner violence. But we also know the resilience. We know the resiliency of survivors. We know the strength and history that has created the foundation for, I know, organizations as myself, but also the activists, the educators, the scholars, the survivors themselves who have made such a difference in terms of how we do this work. So when we think about creating a community of support, when we think about what we as individuals can do, we also want to think what we might look for, what might be things that we might notice in people around us. Veen, would you like to share some kind of signs that we might notice, things to keep an eye out for if we suspect somebody might be experiencing intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. So it can depending on the type of violence that's present within the relationship. And so we've mentioned a little bit about like physical violence, and some of these signs may be a bit more apparent. So things like cuts, bruising, but some things might not be as apparent. And Melissa, I think you had mentioned earlier about in your practice and your knowledge that the emotional and psychological violence is actually quite prevalent. And so I think some of these signs to look for can include things like behavior changes, particularly if the person who is acting abusively is coming in and out of the room. And again, with COVID, maybe that's coming in and out of the screen or the video chat. Could be withdrawing, just having that kind of more depressive anxiety, withdrawing from usual activities, social contacts. There may be a lot more, for the person who's experiencing the violence, a lot more explanation and explaining why their partner may be acting or behaving a certain way, making excuses, or you might find that they are asking their partners for a lot of permission for things. I'm thinking about other examples, like let's say financial abuse and financial violence. You might hear from individuals who might say that they don't seem to have money for basic necessities like food or clothes. If they've got children as well too, not being able to purchase things for the children as well. And so there's a lot of different behaviors that might be not as evident as per se physical abuse and physical assaults. There may also be indicators of someone who is acting abusively. And so if you're noticing like there's more talk of controlling or abusive behaviors, an inability, I think, to take ownership of issues and problems that may arise, someone who regularly disrespects boundaries, privacy, or their partner's belongings and property. Melissa, if I can tag you along too, because I think you had mentioned about gaslighting earlier as well.
Yes, absolutely, and great list. And a lot of times I find individuals often come see me and they're like, I feel like I'm a narcissist, or, I'm not sure if this is happening. And it's when you doubt your reality with gaslighting. And I find that's actually quite common for survivors of abuse as well. And, other things might be emotional dysregulation, having a hard time managing one's emotions, both for the individual who abused and the one who is surviving abuse as well. And another example I was just thinking when listening to your wonderful list there is, we might have even seen this actually when we're all at school or work and we see maybe a friend or colleague, becoming really upset because they're getting multiple text messages, or, they act different after they're around someone, right? Or so that's also part of stalking, right? And so I think there's so many different behavioral things, and you're right, the behavior changes is probably a big indicator of that.
There's also some resources being shared. Thank you, Nancy, for sharing those in the chat to look at around signs of relational abuse. So you can share that for later, explore those a little more. What can we do if we suspect that a friend or family member is a victim of intimate partner violence? Chelsea, when you were talking about your research, I'm wondering, based on exploring those interpersonal barriers, what you might have found.
I definitely found that a lot of people, when someone discloses to you what's going on, a lot of people's first instinct is to kind of, in that empowerment stage, in that you're so strong, like you can do this, you don't have to take this stage, they try and pull them away from that. A lot of people's first instinct can be like, okay, well, like I'll get in my car, like we can go to your house, grab a bag, like you can stay over, like all those kinds of things, which is all loving and caring. But what a lot of people don't understand is that there's so much control and so many other things pulling these survivors in different directions. If it was just as simple as leaving, I feel like a lot of people would, but there's so many barriers. Like, do you have children at home? Do you have the money? Is your partner home right now? What about your job? What about any important things in your house? What about what they're going to say to you? What about the fear? Like, there's also a lot of people don't understand that, which is a scary statistic I learned, is that the most dangerous part of a lot of abusive relationships, and the time when most actual murders from a like a domestic person or domestic murders happen in that time when the survivor is leaving, because the abuser has to make a decision about what they're going to do, and it can turn very violent. Another statistic I learned that a lot of people, I think, may be surprised to hear who are listening, is that it takes an average of 7 times for someone to leave their relationship before they leave for good, because there's just so many different layers that you have to think about, and it's the control and the mind games and the emotional manipulation that can go into that can cause so many survivors to doubt themselves and their abilities and what they can do without their partner after the relationship. And so they can find themselves returning or being convinced to return, even, because it's not just like you leave and the communication stops. A lot of times abuse continues much after they've left. People find creative ways to find you, to communicate with you, and that it becomes more and more difficult.
I just want to comment on Chelsea, as what you just said about like the average of 7 times that people try to leave and then come back. So one thing to do is don't close your door against them, and always let them know that you're there to help, even though if they didn't take your advice, even though they came back and say, you told me this and that make it worse, and this and that and that. It's kind of like you need to understand where they're living and what they're going through, and just leave your door open to them. Whenever they're ready to go, they can reach out. This is like very, very important. If someone is disclosing their stories to you, you need to listen, you need to believe, affirm, and avoid telling them and this is something happens a lot in our community, like the community that we serve, is this advice of be patient. It's going to be changed through time. And also they connect it to religion as well. Like you will be rewarded for your patient for the sake of the kids' stay. All those kind of things. It's even make it harder and harder on them to leave, and also the isolation from the community, thinking that you are the reason of breaking out the family, or taking this person to jail, or this or that. So those are standing in front of them to walk away. It's not that easy. So I just want to also advise everyone to educate yourself about how to help people around you. Maybe your neighbor is going through something and you don't know, or maybe you could have done something that prevent a worse thing to come. So to learn what to do, how to reach out, even what to say in those situations. There's a lot of training available out there. Many of them are free. We run a training in cooperation and partnership with Feminist Shift, and it was all about how to help your neighbor if they're going through domestic violence or intimate partner violence, or any kind of those hard situations.
I'm so glad you both talked about that. I think the number one thing, if I may add on to my fellow panelists here, is to believe them. The amount of courage it takes to actually say, I'm in an unhealthy relationship, or I don't know if I am, takes profound courage. And it is a scary time for anyone involved. And I think it's totally okay if you don't know how to help someone. Like my colleague said here, there's lots of wonderful training. I encourage everyone to take it as well. And I think it's also important to take care of yourself as well. And one of the biggest things I would encourage people to do is actually ask, how would you like me to help you? Often we make assumptions that, just like Chelsea said, I'm going to go run, pack your bag and everything. That's actually extremely dangerous on the majority of cases, right? And that also kind of plays into the control dynamic that they're already experiencing. So I think we need to be very careful about that and ask, what is it that you want me to do? It might just be, I might need you to walk my dog, or I might just need a hug, or you just to know if I don't want to talk right now, that's why. Whatever it is very individualized. And I think we all can be good fellow human beings and just ask that question. So believe them, ask how you can help, and get training would be my advice.
I want to thank you all so much. There's so many questions just from your answers that we could continue on, right, and explore in depth more. But I'm thinking that it would be great. We do have some questions that have been submitted from the audience to see what we can support with. I'm just going to have a look over them. So one of the questions, and I'll open this up to any of you to speak to, is around best practices and strategies for addressing intimate partner violence within already vulnerable communities. Example, people who are unhoused, dealing with substance abuse, addiction, mental illness, people who have disabilities, etc.
I'm happy to jump in just to answer this question a little bit. My immediate thinking would be to actually just ask the individual to see, again, Melissa, you had mentioned about that, asking what that individual would like you to do. There's a lot of power and control dynamics. There's a lot of coercion within intimate partner violence. And so, especially when there are additional intersectionalities, and the person who asked the question had mentioned about, like, if the individual is unhoused or underhoused, if there may be substance use, disability considerations that need to be taken in place. And so maybe asking the individual, like, what is their priority and what would they like you to do? Because maybe it's just as simple as they just want someone to talk to about this. They want a safe space to be able to vent. Or maybe they would like you to go and do some research for them and look at some supports and some services. Again, this can be quite individualized, and it's quite difficult to say that this is the blanket way to approach every individual when they have when they're experiencing intimate partner violence or experiencing other intersectionalities and other considerations that need to be made. And I think a lot of this, as frustrating as it can sound, it is a very individualized approach. And if you are looking for some supports, if you're looking for ways to support an individual that you might know, or a loved one who may be going through this very difficult time, I would actually suggest that you even connect with some of the community organizations and ask them for some supports. You might not have the time to specifically go for training, but a lot of the supports have phone numbers that you can contact, and you can just say, hey, I know someone, I'd like to support them, but I don't know how. What are some of the ways that I might be able to do this with these considerations? And obviously, based off of the comfort of the individual, of how much you are able to actually share about their situation.
Thank you. Did anyone else have anything that they wanted to add? So another question was around growing up or experiencing intimate partner violence as a child, and then navigating relationships after that. So trying to be very conscious of the relationships you chose being not abusive relationships, but then finding out that, of course, you're in an abusive relationship. So based on some folks' clinical experience and research, do you have anything to share for participants who might be in a similar situation?
I just want to thank that participant or participants for bringing it up, because that's not easy to acknowledge, let alone, say, here I am. Just because you were in an abusive relationship as a child growing up, it doesn't necessarily mean you are in one now or will be. And with a lot of it might increase the prevalence, unfortunately, with that, because that's normal for you. With that, however, there is a lot of support out there. You can learn what is a healthy relationship. I would strongly encourage counseling with a therapist that you feel really comfortable with. A good rapport, it's what the word we use, having a good relationship. Does the therapist get you? And do you feel comfortable with him or her or they? Of course, would be important too. And I think, learning about what are your triggers and then how to deal with them as well. And I think just being so brave here today and bringing, being aware of it is a huge start. So I definitely want to acknowledge that. And hopefully my panelists can take in too.
Thank you very much because it takes a lot of courage to say something about that, and also to acknowledge a pattern in your life that may be happening is a lot of self-reflection, and it can really show how intelligent and how self-aware someone can be about what's going on in their life. I think it can be very difficult because a lot of people might grow up seeing something and think, as long as I'm not being physically abused, then I'm not being abused. And so learning about what other kinds of abuse are, I just like looking up or finding resources can sometimes be startling, because you realize oh, maybe this is what I'm experiencing, or maybe this is what I'm feeling. And I think just, again, I agree with reaching out and talking to a counselor if you're worried or thinking that you might be in an abusive relationship. Then talking through it with someone you trust, and just kind of exploring what your thoughts are about what's going on can help bring some clarity to your feeling around the situation and what your next steps might want to be.
And I just wanted to add to, I've worked with children and youth, and more often it's the youth who've grown up and seen violence within the home. And perhaps by the point that they have gotten to counseling, they are no longer in that violent situation. And there may be some fears about, I've heard from my clients, whether or not they might become someone who is abusive. And again, I think similar to what Chelsea and Melissa had mentioned, just because it's something that you may have experienced before does not actually mean that you are either going to experience again or become the abusive individual. I think there is counseling can help. It's a very good tool. It's a really good way to reflect on different dynamics, different historical and familial pieces. But there's also a lot of like things you can do in terms of just self-reflection and understanding, where you can't control necessarily what has happened to you in the past, but you do have some degree of control as to like how you actually want to live your life and move forward. And there's a lot of tools and ways to support that. And I highly encourage everyone to kind of look into that as well.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. Even in general, it's something that it's important to learn about what is healthy relationship. Yeah, so we always talk about this is abuse, this should be, this not. But then what is the healthy relationship looks like, and build on that. So if you can't find this, that means there is a problem. If you're not comfortable, that means there's a problem, and so on and so on. Yeah.
Thank you. And that's so true, right? When we look at prevention work, when we look at support, that reminder of what is a healthy relationship. If you've never experienced it, it hasn't been mentored to you, it can be such an overwhelming concept and really can be a lifelong journey. I know for, myself and experiences, exploring that ongoing. So thank you for reminding us of that. The next question, sparked some interest for myself because there was one book that just came to mind, but if any of the panelists had suggestions of fiction or nonfiction suggestions that accurately depict intimate partner violence in the form of a novel or biography.
One definitely is brought to mind for me when I was researching for my thesis and presenting it. I really was looking at how youth and young adults were targeted, and I found a Wattpad series actually by myself that has now been made into a multi-movie Netflix franchise that's called After. It's about a young teen relationship, and it again is one of those examples where those relationships are extremely romanticized. For my thesis, I went through and I actually broke down like comment by comment, because on Wattpad you can see people's reaction to these moments, and I was so shocked to see like moments of emotional abuse or physical abuse or like neglect or even like kidnapping, and people were romanticizing it. They wished their relationship was like that, and I was very shocked and scared that then when I saw the movie come out on Netflix, it just shows that it can be marketed to people, which is quite concerning sometimes to me.
Were there any other suggestions? That the one that came to mind for me, and I'm trying to look at the author at the same time, was the graphic novel Dragon Slippers. If folks have seen it, this is what an abusive relationship looks like. And even though it was presented in a graphic novel, just how, even in terms of what has been shared about providing resources in different languages, having an illustration depict something that can be so complex and overwhelming when you're living it, and then seeing it broken down, kind of like when we see our friends or peers going through a situation and we can identify, okay, something in that situation's giving me a feeling, but when we're living it ourselves, we question ourselves, we get gaslighted, we go through various things which deter from being in the moment. And it's by Rosalind B. Penfold. But it was just something that we used a lot in our education programming to like illustrate various forms of intimate partner violence, and it really got people to be able to add their own language too, like as a graphic novel, right? Where the language was simple, they could add their own words to situations and explore what their emotions would be in that situation. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Just wondering if there are any other questions out there. And I was really inspired, Wisdom, by your kind of reminder of healthy relationships. So when I was thinking of just what pleasure it's been to be with you all tonight, and to have our participants engaged, you know, in the evening outside of their everyday lives, and really looking at how they as individuals have the opportunity to create that support, to be a part of the community that acknowledges that we all have a responsibility in responding to intimate partner violence, supporting each other, and preventing that trauma and violence from happening. So I would ask kind of, you know, in closing, from each of you, if there was anything you would want to share around healthy relationships, or what kind of thing you would encourage people to value within themselves or in intimate relationships to take away from this moment, to be those things to reflect on throughout their lives. And I'll start with Veen. Put you on the spot right there, Veen.
Appreciate it. I think one of the big things is actually, I think in an individual sense, is to look at some of the your personal values, your personal boundaries, and to have a really good sense of them, because everyone's values and boundaries are going to be quite different, and having a very deep sense of what you want and what is right for you is going to be able to help you with figuring out, like, hey, this is the type of healthy relationship that works for me, and this is the type of relationship that I am looking for. And I think that's a very big piece of it. And I think just also as a social worker and a researcher, looking at more macro, broader pieces as well too. There's a lot of things that we need to do as a community, as a society, to start shifting these conversations about healthy relationship. And Chelsea, I know you mentioned earlier in the evening about things like media, things that we are, you know, we're inundated day in and day out, these type of messaging that's been communicated to us. And I'm just thinking a bit more about like my research and specifically gearing more towards like games research and using games to help prevent intimate partner violence. Whereas we've heard a lot of news over the years with very violent games that promote gender-based violence. And it's like, well, is there a way that we can actually shift that conversation, shift that discourse around a little bit? And so, you know, just a couple of, from like very individual to very more macro shifts and changes that are needed. I think just things for everyone to kind of keep on their mind.
I love that. Thank you. And I'm thinking, you know, parents around the world being like, oh, you know, to be relieved that my child's online learning how to have healthy relationships, you know, is in this safe environment would be so great, right? Chelsea.
I think a big thing that people could consider in their lives and their own relationships is kind of like honesty or dependency and trust. Like, do you feel like you can be 100% honest with this person and how you're feeling or how they're making you feel? When I say dependency, I don't mean like, do you depend on them for everything? I mean, like, can you depend on them if you're in help or if you need help, or if you're in trouble, can you call them? And then trust, finally, do you trust them? Do you trust yourself to be safe with them? Do you trust other people who you care about with them? Because sometimes I think people are shocked when they actually think about that and they realize this may not be what I want, or this may not be what's 100% best for me.
Thank you. Wisdom.
I can talk like up to forever about the healthy relationship, but I remember the first time that really like catch my attention. I had someone who's really dear to my heart, and she was going through intimate partner violence for so many years, and but thankfully that ended, and she walked away, and she managed to get married again and start her life. But what really was surprising, that she was so happy about small things, like he respects me, he opened the door for me, he brought this, he brought but those are like not all the husbands, of course, or the men, they open the door for their wives, but I mean, like this is what, this should be normal. This is not something that you should like like surprise you. So it's kind of like healthy relationship is where you feel yourself. You don't have to pretend be something. You don't have to you know my words are not there, but it's where both of you, like both of the partners are okay with what's happening. They can discuss, they can talk to each other whenever they need to, explain their feelings. They can express that this thing is not working for me, let's try something else. They can grow together, like even like they can develop their knowledge, develop their skills, they grow together, they're very comfortable living together. So this is my, like, very general thoughts about what is healthy relationship, is just to be yourself.
Thank you. And Melissa.
All well said from all panelists here. One of the things in our work is like the power and control wheel, and at the very center is power and control, right? And so the opposite is equality, right? And I would also add respect, as my panelists have mentioned here too. And I don't think any relationship is too costly if we lose ourselves in it, right? If I can't be my true self, that is a red flag for me. So a healthy relationship is based on mutuality, respect, equality, growth, right? And it's okay if you have issues. It's, are you going to be accountable, and are you going to work through it together, right? And I think, to me, the most important relationship you're ever going to have is actually with yourself. And I think when you have a good, healthy relationship with yourself, and sometimes that involves quite a bit of work and self-reflection and maybe therapy and a number of other things, it would also help to influence, hopefully positively, all the other relationships you'll have as well. So that is what I would like to do.
Yeah, so we're seeing here now the power and control wheel that you've referenced. Yes. And so this is looking at when we're talking about a violent relationship, right? And so we don't have the graphic to pull up right away around the equality wheel, but you want to look at how those would be different based on what's outlined around it. So using intimidation, right? The opposite of using intimidation. So not using intimidation, having negotiation, having healthy, open communication. So using emotional abuse as a tactic of power and control. So not using that, talking about fairness, talking about not gaslighting. So it would be, these are the tactics that we often see. So being critical, like all those pieces that folks on the panel have shared to encourage healthy relationships. So thank you for sharing that, Jessica. I think that it's great, and I often hear people say that if you work in social services, or you work with supporting and creating communities, that your definition of a healthy relationship is constantly growing, or it's constantly increasing, right? The more you're open to something. And in addition to what's been shared, I would just highlight consent. I would highlight safety, and then I would really highlight that trusting intuition and gut, because I thought like that was my first reaction around what Chelsea shared around the risk of lethality when individuals are leaving intimate partner relationships, and how in a majority of cases that key indicator was that gut reaction, right? That feeling of not being safe for many people. So trusting your gut, believing in your worth, but also knowing that we can support each other, right? So I just wanted to, as our evening wraps up, thank all of you for being here, give a big round of appreciation to our volunteer providing support for folks in the space, as well as our tech masters from the public library who kept us all hopefully online. We see that there are participants in the room, so we're hoping that you're hearing us. They've done a great job. And just thank you again for giving your time to be here tonight, to come together and to really think about this topic, because the more knowledge we have, the better prepared we'll be, right? And there is no one set solution to responding and supporting somebody. But one thing is key is that you continually learn, right? Because in the same way that each individual, you want to respond with what they need in that moment, that the more open you are to hearing, the better positioned you're going to be to support. So in the sense of creating a community of support, I think we've taken a step and definitely opened a lot of questions for myself, and learned about a lot of great programs. I know that in addition to some of the resources that were shared in the chat, I would just, because I have the mic, I would also remind folks that the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region at saskwr.org provides community-based training. So we'll do public trainings around responding to disclosures, around what is a healthy relationship, what is consent, as well as topics like Chelsea was talking around the impact of media consumption in connection with intimate partner violence and gender-based violence. So we've had a great conversation. I look forward to folks continuing to learn from the resources that were shared, and know that the support line, is specifically SASC's support line that's available 24 hours, is for individuals who've experienced sexual violence, but also for those supporting them. So like Veen mentioned, that those 24-hour support lines are there. So if something in this conversation stirs for you, the next time someone reaches out or something flags in your mind and you want to, do something, but you want to do it with causing the least amount of harm, that you can always reach out and say, how can I best approach this? What's the best approach for the safety of that individual and our ongoing relationship? So thank you, and I hope that you have a great evening.